I never imagined that the deepest betrayal of my life would come from my own son. For most of my life, I believed that no matter how cruel the world became, family would always be a safe place. That belief shattered the day my son looked at me calmly and said he had sold my house and that I had one day to pack my belongings. There was no anger in his voice, no hesitation, just cold certainty. I didn't scream or cry. I simply smiled, and that smile confused him because he had no idea what was coming next. For 37 years, I lived in the same two-story house on Maple Street. That house was more than just a place to live. It was the story of my entire adult life. I raised my son there, celebrated holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries, and shared countless quiet moments with my husband. 5 years ago, cancer took my husband, Tom, and after his death, the house became both my comfort and my pain. People kept telling me it was too big, that I should downsize, that living alone at my age was risky. But to me, leaving that house felt like erasing the last piece of the life I had built. I was 68, but I was far from helpless. I drove myself, volunteered at the local library, attended book club every Thursday, and spent hours tending my garden. I paid my bills on time and managed my own life just fine. Still, my son Brian slowly began treating me as if I were already incapable. First, it sounded like concern. He asked whether I had thought about selling the house, whether it was expensive to maintain, whether I worried about being alone. I laughed it off, assuming he was just being protective. Then the visits started happening more often. Brian and his wife, Tiffany, would arrive without calling ahead. Tiffany would walk through my home with sharp, measuring eyes, commenting on the old kitchen, the heating system, and how much the house could sell for in today's market. Her smile was always polite, but it never felt genuine. I began to feel uncomfortable, as if my own home was being inspected for future ownership rather than respected as my space. The phone calls followed. Late at night, Brian would call asking if I had updated my will, whether I had a healthcare proxy, or if I had considered assisted living. His questions felt less like love and more like preparation. Still, I convinced myself I was overthinking. He was my son after all. I trusted him. Until the afternoon he arrived alone. It was a quiet October day, and I was in the garden trimming the last roses when I saw his car pull into the driveway. The moment I saw his face, something inside me tightened. He didn't greet me warmly or ask how I was. He walked straight into the house and told me we needed to talk. Standing in my living room, the same room where I once held him as a baby, he told me he had sold my house to pay for a vacation. He said the sale would close the next day and that I needed to pack immediately. He spoke as if this decision was already final, as if my opinion no longer mattered. He explained that he and Tiffany were planning a luxury trip to the Maldives for their anniversary, and that they deserved it. He told me he had already arranged a one-bedroom assisted living facility for me, describing it as safe and convenient. That word, safe, echoed in my head. I looked at him and realized I was staring at someone I barely recognized. This wasn't the boy I had raised. This was a man willing to make his own mother homeless for a vacation. What Brian didn't know was that the house was no longer legally in my name. Years earlier, my husband and I had placed it into a living trust, with me as the trustee. Brian had no authority to sell it, no legal power at all. Yet he walked away that day believing he had already won. As he left, I smiled quietly and asked him which assisted living facility I would be staying in. He seemed relieved, confident that his plan had worked. The moment the door closed, my hands began to shake. Not from fear, but from realization. My own son had just tried to steal my home. And in that moment I understood one undeniable truth. If I didn't stand up for myself now, I would lose everything. That night I barely slept. My son's words kept replaying in my mind again and again, like a cruel echo that refused to fade. The idea that he believed he could sell my home without my consent felt unreal, almost absurd, yet the confidence in his voice told me he truly thought he had the upper hand. I sat alone in the quiet house, surrounded by memories, wondering when concern had turned into control and love had turned into calculation. The next morning, instead of panicking, I forced myself to think clearly. Panic would only give Brian the advantage he expected. I opened my laptop, something he clearly assumed I didn't know how to use, and began searching public property records. It took time and patience, but eventually I reached the county clerk's office. When the woman on the phone confirmed that my house was held in a living trust and that I was listed as the sole trustee, a strange calm washed over me. Brian had no legal right to do anything, which meant one of two things. Either he was lying to scare me into signing the house over, or he had attempted something illegal. That realization led me to ask a more disturbing question. Why was he so desperate? Brian had always appeared successful. Nice clothes, expensive car, a polished lifestyle. But desperation doesn't come out of nowhere. I needed answers and I knew exactly where to start. I called one of his colleagues, someone I had met several times over the years and trusted to be honest with me. At first he hesitated, but eventually the truth slipped out. Brian had taken out a massive loan recently. 6 figures. There were whispers at work about missed deadlines, angry clients, and money problems he was trying desperately to hide. My heart sank. The pieces were beginning to fit together in a way I didn't like. Still, I didn't understand why he would destroy our relationship over money, until I checked Tiffany's social media. Her profile was public, filled with carefully staged photos, luxury brands, motivational quotes about success, and one recurring theme: their upcoming dream vacation. Post after post talked about the Maldives, countdowns to their anniversary, and captions about finally living the life we deserve. They hadn't just planned the trip, they had already committed to it. That's when it hit me. The house wasn't just a convenient asset, it was their solution. They had already spent money they didn't have, and now they needed mine to cover it. My home, my security, my memories had become nothing more than a financial escape plan for them. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever imagined. Not just because it was my son, but because they had reduced my entire life to a transaction. Instead of confronting Brian immediately, I decided to do something he never expected. I played along. I let him believe I was confused, overwhelmed, and quietly accepting my fate. While he congratulated himself, I began gathering evidence. I documented everything: messages, timelines, conversations. I knew that if this went any further, I would need proof, not emotion. That same evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Brian asking if I had started packing. He said movers would arrive the next day. Reading those words, I felt something inside me harden. This was no misunderstanding. This was a calculated move. And in that moment, I made a decision that changed everything. I would not be pushed out of my life. I would not be intimidated. If my own son had chosen war over honesty, then I would defend myself, calmly, legally, and without mercy. The next afternoon, I sat in my living room pretending to pack a small suitcase while my mind stayed sharp and alert. I wasn't actually leaving, I was waiting. Every sound outside made my heart pound. Not from fear, but from anticipation. Brian had said the movers would arrive at 3, and I needed to see just how far he was willing to take this lie. At exactly 2:45 p.m., a large white moving truck pulled up in front of my house. Seeing it there, parked at the curb like it belonged, made my stomach twist. This wasn't just a threat anymore. He had turned his plan into action. 2 men stepped out of the truck holding a clipboard and walked toward my front door. I didn't open it. I stood a few feet back, watching through the glass as they knocked. When I finally answered, I calmly asked who had sent them. One of the movers explained that my son had hired them to relocate me to an assisted living facility, and that everything was already paid for. Hearing those words out loud felt like being slapped. Brian hadn't just lied to me. He had lied to strangers, presenting me as a helpless woman who had agreed to be removed from her own home. I took a deep breath and told them they had been misled. I explained that the house was held in a trust and that no move had been authorized by me. The movers looked confused and uncomfortable. They stepped aside to make a phone call, and a few minutes later, they apologized and began loading back into their truck. As the vehicle pulled away, relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. Another car pulled into the driveway almost immediately. Brian's car. And this time Tiffany was with him. They stepped out together, clearly irritated, their expressions tight and defensive. Brian demanded to know why the movers had been sent away. I told him calmly that he had no legal authority to move me or sell the house. His face changed instantly. The confidence disappeared, replaced by anger and panic. Tiffany tried to interrupt, claiming they were only trying to help me, and that I was being unreasonable. Her voice was sharp, desperate, and no longer polite. That's when Brian lost control. He raised his voice, accusing me of being selfish, of holding on to a house I didn't need, of refusing to help him when he was struggling. The truth finally spilled out. He wasn't worried about my safety. He needed money. And when I refused to give him control, he tried to take it. Hearing it out loud confirmed everything I already knew. This wasn't love. This was entitlement. I told them both to leave. When they refused, I made it clear that any further attempts to interfere with my home would be handled legally. The word legal seemed to shake them. Tiffany went silent, and Brian's anger quickly turned into something else: fear. They hadn't expected resistance. They hadn't expected me to stand my ground. After they left, my hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the adrenaline finally wearing off. I sat down and realized something frightening but empowering at the same time. If I hadn't questioned him, if I had trusted him blindly, I would have been gone by now. That house would no longer be mine. My independence would have vanished in a single afternoon. That night, I made the call I had been avoiding. I contacted an estate attorney. Someone experienced, firm, and impossible to intimidate. I told her everything, from the sudden questions to the movers at my door. She listened quietly, then said something I will never forget. What your son attempted is not concern. It's financial exploitation. And you did the right thing by stopping it early. As I ended the call, I looked around my home with new eyes. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about dignity, control, and the right to live my life on my own terms. And I knew one thing for certain: Brian wasn't done yet. People who try to take power don't stop easily. And the worst part of this story was still ahead. After the movers incident, the silence from Brian felt unsettling rather than peaceful. Days passed without calls or messages, and that silence told me one thing very clearly. He was planning his next move. People who try to control you don't stop just because they fail once. They regroup. And that's exactly what Brian did. The first sign came through an email from Tiffany, written in a tone so sweet it almost made me laugh. She talked about family, love, and concern, painting herself and Brian as victims who only wanted what was best for me. She suggested meeting privately without lawyers to clear misunderstandings. I read the email slowly and realized it was nothing more than emotional manipulation wrapped in polite words. Then came the phone calls. Brian left voice messages ranging from apologetic to angry, from tearful to threatening. One moment he was begging me to talk, reminding me that he was my only child, and the next he was accusing me of destroying the family. Each message followed the same pattern: guilt, fear, pressure. I documented everything and said nothing. Silence, I learned, was my strongest defense. A week later they escalated. Brian showed up at my house unannounced with a woman he introduced as a geriatric care specialist. He claimed they were worried about my mental health and wanted a professional opinion on whether I was capable of living alone. Hearing that made my blood run cold. This wasn't about help anymore, it was about control. Declaring me incompetent would give him legal access to everything. My home. My finances. My life. I stood my ground and refused any assessment. The so-called specialist spoke calmly, suggesting that seniors often don't realize when they need help, and that suspicion toward family members could be a warning sign of decline. The implication was clear. My resistance itself was being framed as proof that something was wrong with me. It was manipulation at its most dangerous, designed to make me doubt my own reality. When I asked for proof that their expensive vacation had been canceled, Brian couldn't provide it. His frustration spilled out, and in that moment the mask finally fell. He admitted he was drowning in debt and accused me of sitting comfortably on wealth while he struggled. Tiffany joined in, calling me selfish and stubborn, saying parents are supposed to sacrifice for their children. Listening to them, I realized they didn't see me as a person anymore. I was an asset they felt entitled to. I told them to leave my property immediately. When they finally did, I felt shaken but unbroken. I called my attorney as soon as the door closed and told her everything. Her response was calm but firm. She warned me that Brian's next step would likely be legal, that he might attempt to claim guardianship over me. The idea was terrifying, but I was prepared now. I began installing security cameras, gathering medical records, financial statements, and letters from people who knew me well. I was building a shield around my life. What hurt the most wasn't the legal threats or the accusations. It was the realization that my own son was willing to erase my independence to save himself. The boy I raised would never have done this. But the man standing against me was driven by desperation and entitlement, not love. And deep down, I knew this conflict was heading toward one final confrontation that would decide everything. The official notice arrived on a quiet morning, folded neatly inside a plain envelope that carried more weight than any threat Brian had made before. He was filing for emergency guardianship, claiming that I was mentally unfit to manage my own life. Reading those words felt surreal, like watching my life being rewritten by someone who barely recognized me anymore. According to him, I was confused, isolated, and incapable of making sound decisions. According to him, I needed saving. What he really meant was that he needed control. The hearing was scheduled quickly. Too quickly. My attorney assured me this was common in cases like this. Pressure and urgency were tactics meant to intimidate. Still, the night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not because I doubted myself, but because I knew Brian would say things that would hurt more than any legal accusation ever could. He would weaponize our relationship, our history, and my love for him. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, cold and impersonal. Brian sat across from me with Tiffany beside him, both wearing carefully chosen expressions of concern. To anyone who didn't know the truth, they looked like a worried couple trying to protect an aging parent. When Brian took the stand, he spoke softly, describing how afraid he was for me, how I refused help, how I clung to a house that was too much for someone my age. Listening to him, I realized how convincing lies can sound when wrapped in calm voices and rehearsed emotions. Then the so-called specialist testified, describing my resistance as paranoia and my caution as cognitive decline. She spoke professionally, confidently, as if she were discussing a case study rather than a living person sitting only a few feet away. For a moment I felt small, vulnerable, as if my entire life could be erased by words alone. But then it was my turn. I stood, steadied myself, and spoke clearly. I described my daily routine, my volunteer work, my social life, my finances, and my health. I presented medical records showing no cognitive issues, bank statements proving I managed my money responsibly, and security footage showing Brian's aggressive attempts to remove me from my home. My attorney presented the credit card statements, the luxury vacation payments, and the timeline that exposed the real motive behind this guardianship request. The room went silent as the truth settled in. The judge looked directly at Brian, her expression no longer sympathetic. She made it clear that what he had done was not care. It was exploitation. The petition was denied immediately. Brian was ordered to cover my legal expenses, and the case was referred for further investigation into potential financial abuse. As the gavel struck, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked the breath out of me. I had won, but not in the way people imagine victory. There was no joy in watching my son's face fall, no satisfaction in seeing his plans collapse. Only clarity, only closure. Outside the courtroom, Brian didn't speak to me. Tiffany avoided my eyes. They walked away together, smaller than I had ever seen them before. I stood there for a moment, realizing that the battle was over, but the relationship I once cherished was gone forever. And strangely, I felt at peace. I had protected my home, my independence, and my dignity. No matter what happened next, no one would ever take that away from me again. Life didn't return to normal after the court hearing. It moved forward in a completely new direction. The investigation that followed confirmed what the judge had already seen. Brian's actions were classified as financial exploitation, and the consequences came faster than I ever expected. His employer placed him on leave and later terminated his position. Tiffany's professional reputation suffered as well, and the lifestyle they fought so desperately to protect began collapsing piece by piece. The luxury trip was canceled, not by choice but by necessity, and the image they had worked so hard to maintain faded quietly into embarrassment and loss. A few months later, I received a letter from Brian. It wasn't angry this time, just hollow. He wrote about losing everything, about being misunderstood, about how desperate he had been. He said he was sorry, but the words felt empty, as if they were written to ease his guilt rather than acknowledge the damage he had done. I didn't respond. Some wounds don't heal through conversation. They heal through distance. Loving someone doesn't always mean allowing them access to your life. With my attorney's help, I updated my will and made decisions I never thought I would have to make. My home, the place that nearly cost me my freedom, would one day be used to help others, people who, like me, were betrayed by those they trusted most. It felt right to turn my pain into protection for someone else. For the first time in months, I slept peacefully, knowing my future was secure. Slowly, my life filled with new meaning. I spent more time in my garden, hosted friends, and deepened the relationships that had supported me when my family did not. I learned something powerful through all of this, that family is not defined by blood, but by respect, honesty, and care. The people who stood by me without trying to control me became my true family. Sometimes late in the evening, I still think about the son I raised and the man he became. That loss stays with me, but it no longer defines me. What defines me now is the strength I discovered when I chose myself over guilt, dignity over fear, and truth over manipulation. My home is still mine. My life is still mine. And I am no longer afraid to protect both. So if you're listening to this and wondering whether standing up for yourself is worth the pain, let me tell you this: peace is priceless. No one, not even family, has the right to take your independence in the name of love. Thank you for listening to my story. And if it resonated with you, share your thoughts below. You're not alone, and it's never too late to fight for what's yours.